happening?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Let
Unbelievable.
me share on Twitter.
Oh, yes. Me too.
Mm-hmm. I love your outfit, by the way, and it is very on theme as well.
I was going to say, I feel like we are so, like, we both really got the same vibes of what we need to wear. We're like, we need patterning.
Yes.
Mine is less obvious. I have blue eyeliner on. You did the
Love
blue
that.
eyeshadow.
Yeah. We're dedicated. Dedicated to the bit.
Theme understood. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, there we are.
Okay. And I'm thinking for this one, we can maybe have a more distinct non-spoiler versus spoiler section, because there are definitely a couple of big things that we'll be talking about, but I think we can talk about a lot of the other theme stuff without that. So maybe I'll mention that.
Yeah. At one point in my youth, I made my dad read this book because I again, these are like books where I'm like, everyone should read these. It's like, Father, please. Because he's not a reader, but if it's like short enough, I can usually convince him. And he like said he saw one of the big twists coming. And I was like, no, you didn't, you liar. Maybe you did, but I was so mad.
It's funny because like there have been a few books or series that I have gotten my dad to read as well, and he has also said stuff like that, and it's funny as an adult because I'm like, you saw it coming in a children's book. Yes, like like not that kids books can't be surprising, but it's a little funny to me that like, you know, a grown adult would be like didn't fool me. Not to mention, like, I have read some middle grade mysteries or books that like have some kind of like twist that I didn't see coming as an adult. So it does happen, but it's just like a funny thing to hear is like, you didn't fool me, 7 to 8 like age range. Like,
well, and I don't really think personally, well, I guess we'll talk about it later. I think there are parts of the book that could hint towards one of the twists, and and then some things that would mislead you. So
yeah, and actually, like one of the things, and I think we probably talked about this for The Giver, I don't remember, but one of the things that I have been really appreciating about this series, and I think one of the reasons that it is so broadly enjoyable, like even for adults who have read a lot, I think that the dread and the anticipation of seeing what's coming is its own kind of like build up, you know. Like I think that like if it takes you by surprise, I think it's effective, but if it doesn't, if you're like, oh my god, I know what's coming, like it also works.
Yes, this has nothing to do with anything, but the audiobook that I'm listening to currently is My Lover's Lover by Maggie O'Farrell. And it's like one of her older books. It was published in like 2004. And every cover that this book has does it no favors because it does not, it either looks like it's like women's fiction or like some just kind of general literary fiction. Like this book is domestic suspense, I swear. Like it is, I'm on the edge of my seat. And basically that's what I'm trying to say. It's just like the feeling of dread while reading a book is like my whole time I'm like, oh, I don't even know what's going on, but I'm just like in it, you know?
Yeah, just general anxiety.
Yeah.
Hello, welcome.
Hi.
We were discussing how it's so fresh and unusual that we're a couple minutes early. So I'm going to finish linking things, and then I think we can start with introductions.
Sweet.
Let's see.
Taking a picture for my Instagram story. There we are.
Okay. I probably should.
Sorry, I went to take a picture for my Instagram story, and I'm like, cheese, and you're like, ugh.
Oh no.
I won't use that one.
My focus face looks really angry. I have heard this from many people.
That's fair. I think mine is much angrier than I realized until I like catch myself and I'm like, oh, you're so furrowed right now.
Yeah. It's that intense focus. Okay. So if we want to go ahead and do a quick intro, Julia, if you want to share a little bit about the kinds of things that you read and your content, and I guess we can do at the same time a fun little question since we both read and enjoy historical fiction. I would love to hear about an era that you think we need more books in, that like you think is underrepresented. Yeah.
What a question, honestly. We'll get there. So yes, my name is Julia. My channel and subsequent social media stuff is Shakespeare and such. And I read a good mix of things, but lately a lot of historical fiction, romance, some fantasy here and there. It's an amalgamation of things. But mostly reading my physical TBR books, right, Kara?
That's right. I know, we're squaring up again. Yeah.
And then, okay, an era or like time period that I think we need more historical fiction in. My first like gut reaction answer, because of how frequently I read and reread the Felicity books as a kid, would be like colonial America.
Yeah. Okay, that was one of the ones that I thought of too. Like I think surprisingly for how US centric publishing is, there's not a ton in that era, like in the Revolutionary era. So
yes, yeah, it's definitely, and it's weird too, especially with like the big boom of Hamilton. You think we would have seen a lot more in that sort of time period. No. And then like the one historical romance that I had that was like in that time, I DNF'd and I couldn't stand. So it's not boding well. So that's definitely one that like came to mind right away. But I feel like, I don't know, there's so many good, like interesting like places and times. I also very much was like, well, no, that's not even fair. There are, well, fiction? I don't know. I also really liked ancient Egypt as a kid, as many children do.
Julia, that was my other answer. I love this. I was gonna be like, I was an ancient Egypt kid, and arguably still am. And like specifically, what I would like to see more of is authors getting publishing deals who are actually like from that region and who have like, you know, history or like knowledge of that era. Like not that you can't write, I don't know, historical fiction is kind of a weird category when it comes, because like how far back do you have to go? Like, do you consider that to be like, you know, own voices or something? But I do just think it would be a really important and a really cool perspective to have, is like ancient Egypt written by people who live in that area or whose families are from that area. I love, like, we are so insane. So this was in a way not as fun of a question as I thought, because our answers are the same.
Well, here, I'll give you one more that is extra specific because it was my other childhood hyperfixation. I know there are actually quite a few, but I want more books about the Titanic, set on the Titanic, surrounding the events of the Titanic. I love the Titanic. And that Dear America, it was like Voyage on the Titanic or something like that. Like,
Dear America was rough. Like,
they were painful.
They did not pull punches. Like Dear America or Royal Diaries. Like they went hardcore. They were like, children can take it. The Romanov one, the last scene is them being led into the basement to be executed. Like, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Like all the Royal Diaries ones were like, and here's how that royal was about to be executed. The end.
Like the author's note, they're like, here's exactly what happened. Yeah. So I agree with both of those answers, and not so much on the Titanic one, because even though I find it fascinating, it creeps me out. But I do agree that it makes for compelling stories. And I actually, in a way, I think I find the nonfiction bits that are in stories about the Titanic like even more interesting. But another answer that I was thinking of was, I feel like I would like to see more like Gilded Age historical fiction, which that's another one where, considering the show, you'd think there would have been more of a boom, but like I just find that like turn of the century like opulence and like all of the class like commentary and everything, I just find that really interesting. And it's funny because I don't love contemporary books set in New York. Like I just don't have that like burning desire to live in New York City that I think a lot of authors assume people have, but I love it in historical fiction. Like I love like 1900s, like turn of the century New York City. So that would be one. I'm trying to think of another one besides Ancient Egypt. Yeah. I think also, and this is something that we are starting to see a little more of, but historical fiction written by Native or Indigenous authors, I think is still really underrepresented, which is not because they're not telling those stories, it's because they're not getting picked up for book deals. But I think that is like a real, because like that covers so much history.
Sorry,
and,
yes.
Yeah. What?
You struck me with inspiration. I also want more Westerns. I want Wild West, but not about men. Not when you go to Barnes and Noble and you go in the Western section and it's like 900 books by William J. Johnstone. Like, I don't want those Westerns. Yeah. I want girly Westerns.
Or like Westerns by marginalized authors.
Yes. Like, honestly, Westerns by Indigenous authors would be dope. I would love that.
So good. Actually, there's one, I think there's one that's sort of adjacent to that. I'll have to look up what the title is, but yes, I would love that. Well, thank you, Alex, saying our making outfit very funky and quirky. Yes.
And the Wild West is the best historical fiction setting, in my opinion, because you can get like literally like any kind of person there. Like you got Chinese immigrants, you've got people coming up from Mexico, you probably have former slaves, you have like all these different kinds of people all in one location. Like it's so juicy. Yeah. It's so real, you know? It's like
yeah. I think sometimes people lose sight of the fact that like historical fiction also had non-white people. Like it's not like I think all the time about a quote from Psych, which is a show that I really enjoy, where they're making like Gus, who's played by Dule Hill, who's a Black actor. His character is like, oh, well, I could play the inspector. And they're like, well, this is set in Victorian London. And Gus is like, are you saying Black people haven't been invented yet? Like, it's ridiculous because it's true. Like that is how people sometimes act. Like, okay. So transitioning now into the actual discussion that we're here for. Although I love our historical fiction opinions.
A new book club, historical fiction.
Or even just our opinions.
It's not a book club, it's a podcast.
So we are here to discuss Gathering Blue by Lois Lowry. This is part of the Not a Genre book club. I only just realized that there is an actual sewing needle on the cover.
There sure is.
I can't believe I didn't notice that.
And it's so central.
I know, very thematically appropriate, and I did not see that. So this is the second book in the Giver series, and just very, very briefly, if you haven't tuned into Not a Genre book club before, it's a book club I created that is about reading and discussing middle grade and young adult books with the same kind of analysis and attention that we more often associate with adult or classics. So, briefly, some content warnings before we get into the discussion. This book does deal with grief, ableism, eugenics, poverty, and then there are references to animal sacrifice and corporal punishment and child abuse. I think some of these are going to come up more than others. Like definitely ableism is going to be a big one. But yeah, so just be aware of that. And I think we are going to be able to talk about a good chunk of this before getting into really specific spoilers. So I will give a warning before we do that. Okay, so Julia, do you want to start us off with your previous experience with this book particularly? Because I know that you have read this series several times. I have never read it. and just like overall thoughts on this read.
Yes. So I genuinely don't know which one I read first, if it was Gathering Blue or The Giver, but I remember both of them I read for the first time in 5th grade, and I'm sure those were the only two out at the time. So I just like kept rereading those two. I was like, good books. But I loved Gathering Blue. I remember very specifically, this is like not relevant to the conversation, but relevant to the book. My 5th grade teacher had like one of those giant like pads of paper that it was like for vocabulary building. So when we had our like silent reading time, if you found a word that you didn't know in your book, you'd go add it to the list so we could like all learn each other's words and stuff. And so that's when I learned the word embroider was through this book. And I think a couple other words too, but that's the one I remember because I was like, oh, fancy word.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember being very captivated by the story and the twists, and Kira was such like a strong character that really like stood out to me as someone who is in a position who like has no power, and yet she actually does have a lot of agency in her story, and she like makes her way in the world the best she can. And that was something that really stuck with me as a kid. And I have reread it not as many times as The Giver, I don't think, but definitely quite a few. So
Yeah,
a good one.
it is a good one. And I believe we both gave it 4.5 stars, like around there, because it's not quite as like perfectly executed as The Giver, but I still really enjoyed it. And actually, like, this is the weird thing is like there are parts of this one that I actually enjoyed more, or that I thought like I like that this story, even though it is still very like tightly focused, I think it has, like we were saying before the discussion, like it has a lot of range in the kinds of things that it talks about, and even in the plot. I think the plot is a little more varied. So I think that it is still a really excellent book. And I also wonder if part of the reason that I was like, oh, maybe it's not quite a 5 stars is because I should have looked at my edition, because I'm like reading at the end here and I'm like, okay, we've got like maybe 10 pages like to wrap this up. I turned the page, the book's over. And I was like, what?
That's one of the things about this book too that is like less perfect to me than The Giver. Is even though they both have quite open endings, I feel like this one is even more abrupt, and I'm like, hey, I need a little more than that. Like
what? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I am gonna try not to compare to The Giver too many times, except there's a few questions that I think it is really relevant. Because I do think this book can like stand on its own, like it is good in its own right.
100%. That's one of the reasons too that I think I may have read this book before The Giver, is because like, one, I would have gravitated toward the book about a girl rather than a book about a boy, because but they're such separate entities, even though they have connections, that I don't think it would have mattered where I started.
Right. Like I think that the cool things about reading them both is thinking about how they approach different, like the same ideas or different ideas. It's not so much like, oh, there's character crossover, because like there isn't really, like there's almost no actual connections. Okay, so the first question is, the setting of this book is ostensibly extremely different from The Giver. For sure. So I wanted to talk about like the ways that they are different, but also I think there are some like similarities in like the values of the society. And so I wanted to, this is like a classic like short answer question. How are they similar? How are they different? Compare and contrast.
Like a Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, of course, the similarities come kind of in how the power is structured in their communities. They both have very rigid, like, these are the people in charge. And I guess it is kind of interesting. No, I was going to say something, but then I think that's not true. I think in both cases, those councils then pick the next council members, right? Like there's no
I
sort
think
of,
so. I think so.
yeah, there's no sort of democratic element to
No, I think
anything.
it's pretty like insular.
Yeah. So there's that element. But then of course, and this is where it's a hindrance to have more information about this series than you. So I won't say one thing that I'm thinking, but
Okay. Hold that thought for like 2 more months.
but it's not a spoiler. It's just I think about it differently depending on what I know,
Okay.
or
Yeah,
if I
so
didn't know
maybe
that.
yeah.
But Kira's community in Gathering Blue seems much more rural, much more. It feels like a world that is very like more recently like post-apocalyptic, where it's like there's this remnant of some big building and like a church, and you can get from the clues like what these buildings were. But when Kira goes in there for the first time, she's like, I've never been in a place like this. Like I have a room with walls and a door, and it's like one room of many in this building. Like that's wild. Like a lot of the structures are kind of described as like huts and what do they make for the children? Like a pen to contain their children, like
livestock.
Yeah. So it's very different. Whereas Jonas's community in The Giver feels like something where if it is in a dystopian future, that like either it's like a sort of a community that was built in time beyond Kira, so like that turned into that, or it's like less like sort of apocalyptic, but more of a dystopian sense in like this is what our sort of communities now evolved into. Like it feels more suburban. That's a word, right?
Suburban, yeah.
Suburban. I was like, yeah, why can't I? So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I was reading Gathering Blue, the thing that the setting, because like you were saying, it's very rural, it's very like it's obviously like their technology is not the same as like Jonas and his community. And I hesitate to even say like less advanced, because I don't necessarily think that's like a fair, like it's almost like a value judgment you're making, but like they don't have like electronics and things.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. Like, just seems like a lack of electricity. Like, they don't have speakers, but they have bells.
Yeah. And like the thing that I kept thinking about is prior to reading this series, the only thing I had read by Lois Lowry was a historical fiction she did called The Windbee Puzzle, which is like prehistory historical fiction. And I didn't care for that book a ton. So I'm glad that I'm loving this series. Like, but I didn't really have a great time with the other book. But the setting, that is really what it felt like reading Gathering Blue, is like almost historical fiction in like prehistory times, because of like the way they describe the structures. And like there are those things that are, like you said, hinting to this is post-apocalyptic rather than like early history. But it was really interesting. Like that's obviously a very different feel from The Giver and from like Jonas's community. But I think you had a really good point that one of the similarities that stood out to me as well is like in the view of power. And it's interesting that like, so The Giver is like, looks like a utopia, but it actually isn't. And then Gathering Blue is like, looks really bad in terms of people's living conditions. And then you find out like, oh wait, it's bad in a different way. But so I don't know. I thought that was interesting as well, that they're sort of getting at the same thing from very different like story choices, which I think is cool.
And it is, I didn't even think of this until now, but it is also interesting that in The Giver we have very specifically the sameness, right? So like everyone in the community is equal, even if they're not like, one of the like people who actually holds power in terms of like amending laws and things like that. But in Gathering Blue, you very much see divides between different groups and classes of people. Matt and his.
And they one difference between the societies is like I feel in Gathering Blue there is a much clearer like withholding and weaponizing of like basic comforts, like basic like living conditions.
Like resources.
What's that?
Yeah, like just resources.
Yeah. Whereas with Jonas, the method of control is very different. It's much more about like convincing people that they're not missing anything. You know, like their bodies are completely taken care of. So what could be wrong? Whereas in Gathering Blue, it's like they sort of keep the people down by not even giving them the resources to like it's like they don't even have the energy to like think about rebelling because they're like trying to survive.
Yeah.
And I feel like the governmental, I don't know, the council, the body of the people in charge, either they are intentionally prolonging that or they started that deliberately or it was happening by itself and they're like, well, we're going to use this. Like, however it came about, I think they're very like aware of like just, and the way that they like weaponize gratitude is so insidious. And I think that's so smart that Lois Lowry like shows us that like one of the reasons that it is hard for Kira and Thomas to start noticing that things are wrong is like they have life that is so good compared to so many other people. And it's like they understandably they don't want to jeopardize that, and it's hard to even like think badly of the people who sort of like rescued them, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I know. I was thinking too. I had to look up her name, Vandara. I wanted to say Vidya, and I was like, no, that's that mean fairy from the Tinkerbell series.
What a dramatic crossover that would be like.
But with the original like trial, I guess, between Vandara and Kira, even though, you know, she loses, or they both lose in a sense, but again, it's kind of rigged in a way where the people in power can be like, you're welcome, you want it, like you owe us.
Yeah. And they like never state it outright, you know, obviously, because that would I think make people a lot more suspicious. They're not saying like in exchange for, you know, having enough to eat and having a room and having a place to sleep, like you are going to do all these things for us. They just like act as if it's through generosity, and it creates this like loyalty from these kids who are, I mean, I feel like this is sort of an example of like non-sexual grooming in a way, because it's like very intentionally like focusing in on these children and having them like raised to be fully on board with what the council is doing.
Right.
Hello.
They're even more impressionable and you know, in a place in their life where they don't have anyone else looking out for them. So
the fact that they like target orphans and other things that are in spoiler territory.
We'll talk about it later.
yeah. Hold that thought, everyone.
Yeah.
And then we talked a little tiny bit about Kira already, but let's talk about her more as a protagonist. What do we think? I know you mentioned that you really liked her, that she left an impression on you, and I really liked her as well. I admire her so much, and I like that. I mean, this is a fairly old book to feature a disabled character, and I feel like, I mean, I'm not speaking from personal experience, but at least in terms of the storytelling, it feels pretty respectful. And like, obviously there is ableism, and Kira deals with some of that internalized ableism as well. But like, in terms of how complex her character is, and you mentioned, Julia, how she has a surprising amount of agency considering what the story is, like, yeah, so I really liked Kira. I really felt for her. I was so like proud of her when she started putting pieces together, and she was like her life has been so hard. And so for her to still find out these things and to realize that going against the like government or whatever is going to, you know, possibly take these things away or like put her in actual danger. And the fact that she's like she considers just staying quiet, but she's like, I can't take that at the expense of other people. I'm like, I'm so proud of you. Like she's this like
Yeah.
little kid who's having to make these choices, but it's still in a way that feels like a realistic mindset for a young kid. Like I feel like one of the things that good middle grade authors do is like they have main characters who are believably shaped by the things that they've gone through that kids shouldn't
Mhm.
have to go through, but also they are still children and we don't lose sight of that. And
Yeah.
like that's how I felt about Kira. Like she just had so much put on her, and yeah, love
Yeah.
that girl.
I completely agree. I think, again, I can't speak from any personal experience, but I think the representation piece of her disability was very balanced in that we showed ways that, it potentially, hindered things that she wanted to do or made things harder for her, but then also things that were inherently Kira that were because of that disability that, it would feel like a different story if that wasn't the case for her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like you said, I think it was dealt with quite respectfully overall. I love that, again, and honestly, they don't actually tell us her age, do they?
I don't remember. As we've discussed, I'm not good at picking up on character
I don't
ages.
think they ever specifically say her age. And I assume she's around Jonas's age,
Yeah.
potentially veering a little older. Like I kind of picture like 12 to 14 is somewhere kind of where she falls, but I could be shooting higher. I don't know. That could be me like projecting because I want her and Thomas to be boyfriend and girlfriend. But that's a different story. We'll talk about that later. Um,
Yeah, I did get that vibe. I was like, I don't know if that's this kind of bug, but like
it could be.
it could be.
But I think that, she's very believably young, and like you said, the experiences that she goes through do very much color her choices further on, and I think she has understandably some things that, make her scared, but also she's ultimately a very hopeful character, and that's probably why we both love her.
Yeah. I am kind of astonished that so far this series is very hopeful. Like that's I mean that's the kind of like I guess dystopian or like sort of that subgenre of like speculative fiction. Like that's the kind that I enjoy where it's like this is how bad things can get or how bad things are, and also there are good people who do something about it and who want to do something, and like they find each other, and that's how you get like and on that note, let's talk about
You're gonna
Thomas.
make me cry just by being like, they find each other. Dang it. Okay. It's too early. I didn't even cry when I reread it. I was rock solid.
Yeah. But we'll cry discussing it in a second. So speaking of, these good people finding each other, let's talk about Thomas. I sort of like two separate, I guess, discussion points with him is like just how did we feel about him? How did we like him as like not a main character, but like the supporting character for the main character? Because he's very important. I would argue that he's like the most important character besides Kira herself. So kind of like just how we felt about him, and then also what is his role in the story? Like what was the intention for Lois Lowry including him and writing him in this way? So
Wait, you think Thomas is more important than Matt? I just want to unpack that. Sorry.
No. Like, I guess because the parts, like Kira has more history with Matt, but I think the parts of the story that Kira and Thomas are together for, like the plot stuff, I think because of how significant those things are, I think that sort of colors my impression. But I definitely can see an argument for Matt being like the second lead character. Yeah, but I think of Thomas as being second lead.
I mean, I love Thomas. I'll happily talk about him. I just was surprised that that was your opinion. Yeah, I really like Thomas. I think he's a little sweetie. I like the way that he and Kira do have, um, I mean, naturally with the circumstances that brought them into their position where they are when they meet in the story. They obviously have a lot of similarities, but I like, seeing how their stories do parallel one another, and, the things that they learn and the speculative elements of the book, question mark, much like The Giver, where I'm like, hey, we're never going to know what that was about, huh?
Is there magic? We don't know. Like,
yeah, so I like to see how they have those things in common, but he's also, he's not the same as Kira either. Obviously, he's been living and working in the was it the council building? I don't know what they call it, for much more of his life, and so that's shaped him in a way that he's obviously less like suspicious of anything going on. He's like, this is normal. This is my life. Things are good here. But he's also so helpful and so like kind. I love when he is like, oh, well, if you just remember it, I'll write them down for you and I can read you all the plants so you can memorize them. I'm like, you're the best boy. You're so sweet.
I know. I also love Thomas. Like, I'm so happy that Kira has like friends,
I know.
that like she's not just like completely isolated. Yeah, like I also really like Thomas, just like his personality. He is so sweet. He is like just such a genuinely good person. And I think I want to touch on one of the other things you said, which I feel like answers the second part of the question, which is like, what is his role in the story? When you were talking about how he has grown up much more like indoctrinated in this way of life, I think that is one of the important functions of his character, is we see how different that is from Kira, but also how they have these similarities. And like, even though, as you said, Thomas isn't as suspicious as quickly as Kira is, and not that she's like immediately suspicious, but it takes him longer to sort of start like, maybe some of these things aren't right, this isn't adding up. It takes him longer, but I feel like we get the sense that he does still have those morals and those feelings. And like, one of the things that I also loved about The Giver, and like, I think this is one of the reasons that this series is just going to be very Kara very Kara focused, is like, I really love when authors are having like a character that is like, hey, these things are bad and I need to fix it. I love when they show us that like other people also have this like possibility. Like, if Thomas and Kira had slightly different experiences, it could have gone the other way, and that Thomas would have been the one. Like, and to me, that is a good thing, that we get this sense that it's not like our one hero convincing all the sheep, that like things are wrong. Like, I love that sense that like there are many of these people who have this compassion and who have this capacity to care and to do something about it, and it's about activating that, and who has that activated first, basically. I just think that's really beautiful, and I also think that's a much more like practical and hopeful way to think about social change, yeah, so I love Thomas, and I also love kind of what he does in the story. So I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that.
No, I super agree with you on that. I think because even the things that, and like you said too, it's not that Kira shows up there and she's like, things are sketchy here, like not that at all. But when she starts to first get inklings of like, oh, I don't like the way they're doing that, Thomas is quick to be like, oh, well, like when they encounter the locked door, right? Thomas is like, well, no, that's actually not unusual. This happened to me, so he can kind of like rationalize it more quickly, but it's not like in that scene he was discounting Kira's concerns. Like, he was still like, let's keep tabs on this. Like that is, like we should still explore further, but like maybe it's not as bad as you think. Hopefully, is like kind of where he was coming from. But yeah, what else was I gonna say about you, Thomas? I don't know, but I like him. Oh yeah. Oh no, it wasn't even about Thomas. It was just what you were saying about like how social change works or should work, hopefully. And this series, I keep touching my books to the side, but you can't see that I'm doing that. Is that is like my favorite thing about Gathering Blue, especially because it's even more of a bigger core group than what we had in The Giver. And it's, as you can see in my Goodreads review, it's just like all these good people coming together and finding each other. I'm like, yeah, friends, you can do it.
Yeah.
I just love that.
Yeah, I think that is really beautiful. And I think that more authors should, I don't know, tell dystopians this way. Like, I genuinely think I would read a lot more dystopians if there were more of them that were like this, or like the Chaos Walking books by Patrick Ness. Like, yeah, I really like that. And it's not that, like, these books absolutely take the serious things that they're talking about. They take those seriously.
Oh, yeah.
And yet they're still told with this like humanity and this like hope and love that is just really beautiful, and it makes for a satisfying story as well. Yeah. And last thing about Kira and Thomas is I did want to briefly address when you're like I kind of ship them. I like didn't know if that was something that was supposed to be like suggested to us, but like I love their friendship as is, but I also would not be mad if that was like a sort of like little kid like crush, like a crush where it's not like, I don't know. Sometimes middle grade authors like write it and I'm like, this is a little uncomfy. I don't know. Like it's like not like inappropriate, but it's just like it feels strange to have it written a certain way when it's like, well, these are kids who are just barely starting to like have these feelings. So
sure.
But yeah, I just really love them together in any capacity. I really enjoyed their friendship and the way that they like relied on each other and helped each other, like Thomas helping her study, and Kira just like she's such a caring person, and like anytime she like comes up against basically anybody, she's like, all right, well, you're part of my little nest of chicks now. It's like I have to I now keep all of you safe. It's like, I love her.
Yeah, that's
He's
so
like, you're adopted. Welcome. Like
that's what I'm saying. It's like peak found family. Gathering Blue.
Really is.
Yeah. I shipped them as a child when I was reading it, and I still ship them. I think
on our theoretical like opinions podcast, we would have a whole episode that was like formative fictional ships, because I've got a few. Okay, so another thing about Kira that we did kind of talk about was sort of her arc of like realizing what's going on and realizing the danger she's in. I think probably at this point we're going to sort of shift into spoiler territory. So if anybody is watching who does not want to be spoiled for the reveals, we will see you later. But
and frankly, if you're watching this and you haven't read Gathering Blue, thank you. That's so sweet. Leave. Go read the book. I want you to.
Julia has spoken.
Right.
Yeah, so like just if we want to talk a little bit more in detail about that creeping unease that is so well done. And I don't remember if this was after we had gone live, but Julia and I were discussing how both of these books have been very effective whether or not you know what's coming. And I think that's one of the things that makes them very like enjoyable and very like not approachable. I don't know what word I'm looking for, but like adults and kids can read them and get a lot out of them. And it's like, it's a whole different kind of enjoyment and storytelling when you as an adult are reading this and you're like, oh my God, I know what's coming. I know some things are happening, but the way it's done, it doesn't like, that doesn't spoil the anticipation. It's like I'm like waiting for Kira to figure stuff out, and she is figuring it out. Like she is like making these connections, and I'm like a couple steps ahead of her because like I'm an adult.
Yeah.
But it doesn't like that's effective, you know. It's like not to the detriment of the book. So
yeah.
If we had thoughts on specifics about that, like
well, since we're in spoiler territory, I think the big one where we see the shift of like perhaps, well, not even perhaps, at the beginning, I think Lois Lowry does such a great job of portraying Jameson as a caregiver and a guardian. And, you know, just initially, like the first, like being like her lawyer, I don't think that's what they called it, but, you know, like it was very effective and fair and like, okay. And then, you know, he takes her to a room and gives her all this stuff. And it's like, okay, great. And the moment where there's such a clear shift for me and probably a lot of readers, probably my dad, is when Kira confesses that, what on earth is her name? The dyer. What's her name?
Yes, I was thinking of, it's like, I think of her as like
Annabella?
the herb witch. Yeah.
The herb witch. Is it Annabella?
I think so.
It's 4 syllables. She's so old.
Oh, that was another cool thing. The syllables and
The
like
naming
the
system?
language. Yeah.
Yes, it's Annabella. I just found it, luckily. So when she says that Annabella insists that there be no beasts, right? And then Jameson like shuts down clearly, like is so cold and was like, she's a crazy old lady. And then the next time we try to see Annabella, she is no longer with us.
Yeah.
And that is when I clearly go, oh, I see the consequences of the actions here. Even though Kira doesn't, she's a child, you know. But yeah, I think that's like a really big shift. I don't even think this answers what you were trying to talk about in terms of her revelation.
No, it does. Like, cause it was a very like nebulous, like, let's just talk about the the growing unease and tension. Yeah, I think that is a really effective moment in this story because even before Kira tells Jameson and he reacts so badly and suspiciously, even before that, just like when she's like, well, my father was killed by wild beasts in the forest, and Annabella's like, there aren't any, and I'm like, whoa. Like, I don't know if have you watched the Avatar The Last Airbender show, but it was like,
yeah, the animated one, yeah.
Yes, it's like there is no war in Boston. Like, it was like
it's creepy.
Immediately like so just I don't know, like what a great little like bomb to drop on us. Like, oh, there aren't any wild beasts, because immediately that tells you other things are going on. Something else killed her dad, and I was like, I thought it was probably another hunter, but I think like the most shocking part about that is just like this reality that Kira has grown up with, that everybody has grown up with. Everybody just knows they're like, yeah, beasts are in the forest, they attack you, don't go in there. And it's like, actually that's not true. And I'm like, so that means somebody else is doing the attacking. And I think like also one of the earlier kind of clues or moments that it isn't like overly telegraphed to the reader. I think it's like woven in there in a way that like, yeah, I could see readers, like especially younger readers, not picking up on that. But I also think that if you do pick up on it, it contributes to a different kind of like anticipation or enjoyment. Is the moment when Kira and Thomas are kind of realizing like, oh, we're all orphans. Like, that's a little weird.
Yeah.
Like, what a coincidence. And like,
I thought,
yeah, what a funny world. I thought initially that they actually were like assassinating the parents of the kids that they like, which honestly we don't know didn't happen. Her mom very much seems like she was poisoned. So
I would maintain that at least half of those parents did not die of natural causes, because it could be a case where it's like one is gone and then it's like, well, if we get the other one out of the way, now we have this child.
Yeah. I think all of those like surprise moments, whether they're surprising or not, are really effective.
Yeah. Oh, because what's baby girl's name? what's Joe? Joe? Is that her, the singer?
Oh, I don't remember. I think you're right, but
She's little, so she only has one syllable. That's all I can remember is how many syllables somebody has.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, okay, wait. Joe, yes.
okay. Because Joe literally was like, yeah, my parents both got struck by lightning. And I was like, what were they doing? Going for a walk holding hands in a thunderstorm? Like, how would it get them both so immediately?
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Like, that one's suspicious.
Right? Like the her
Oh,
have
no.
terrible,
Oh, okay.
like what's that?
You froze for half a second and I was terrified.
No. Okay, we think good so far. The thing with Kira's mother, it's like that could have been, a naturally occurring disease or something, especially because everybody is very specifically kept in poverty.
Mhm.
And then like with her dad, it could have been like obviously I think it was foul play, but it could have been a more like isolated incident. But it's like when you start getting all of these things, like, yeah, this is not an accident.
Mhm.
Yeah. And okay, let's see. All right, so this is another one of the questions I have that does explicitly compare the two books.
Ooh.
So something that I think is incredibly interesting is that both of these books are dystopian stories where the main characters realize the bad things are happening from within the system. It's not like a Divergent where she gets taken by the rebel group and she just sort of gets brought into the rebellion. It's like
Yeah.
they're in it and they notice. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think even more interesting to me is that it also happens through these very official channels. Like I find that so fascinating that basically like Jonas is like radicalized through his job that he is assigned. I know it's a weird way to put it.
Yeah, no, it's true.
And with Kira, it's like the same thing. It's like through the work that she is like given through her like apprenticeship to Annabella, which is very official.
Mhm.
Like I find that so interesting, and so I wanted to talk about like, do you think? I don't know. What do you think that Lois Lowry is saying with that? And what is the effect with the story?
Wow, that's super interesting. I never thought of it that way, but you're so right. And I would also, before I even answer that question, I would also argue a little bit too that even Kira's job of embroidering the robe is also kind of helping her gain more knowledge and more insight into the history of the world. And
Yeah,
that could be shaping her as well because, she's.
especially because she can't read.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Oh my God.
yeah.
Wow. Okay. um, so what do you think? What do we think Lois Lowry is trying to do with that?
Yeah, like why did she do that? And or I guess this is sort of the same question. Like what is the effect with the story? Like what do you think that makes the story do?
Yeah. Well, I think that's so fascinating. Because in a sense, like I'm trying to think of like in the modern real world, right? Like you have people who like believe in conspiracy theories and stuff, and they convince other people that those conspiracy theories are real. But in order for you to be convinced by them, you already would have to have either that person is very convincing or like you have some kind of disposition to not trust the authority or to like kind of go against the grain in some sense versus like if you got a job for the government and your boss sat you down and was like aliens are real and blah 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 blah, like you would be like, oh my God, wow. So it's just so fascinating that it would come through the official channels, so to speak, because to us as the reader, I think it's even more apparent that the things that our main character is perceiving as wrong are wrong because she's saying like they're not mistaking them, like this is being told to
Mhm.
them that this is how it is. And so then the way that character feels about it, and us reading that as the reader, and that was redundant. It's just even more, I guess, impactful
Yeah.
in a sense.
Like that the evils that are being done on purpose.
Yeah.
And they're official. And I think like your answer made me think of how when we talk about, terrible things that have happened or are happening in our world, I think it's not that like one thing makes them worse than another, or like it's like less of an atrocity if it's not sanctioned.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is a specific like response we have when it is horrible evil that is done through official means,
Mm-hmm.
like organized genocide, like there is something specific about that. Not that it is better or worse than another kind of evil, but it's like I think that does affect humans, like when we know that it is something that is sanctioned by the government or by any other like official force, when something is legal. Like the fact that slavery was legal for so long in the US, it wasn't just that these horrible things were being done to Black people, it was that like the laws were telling you or were allowing it, encouraging it. Like, yeah. I hope that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense to me.
And then I also think, let me try and like get my thoughts in order here.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other outcomes of having the characters realize things like this, I think one of the things that Lois Lowry seems to be really emphasizing in the series is, this sounds so bland, but like the power of knowledge, of like information.
Yeah.
And how like the basic like foundation of any kind of activism, I guess you could say more broadly, is knowing the truth, like knowing what's happening. And I think that's why, I mean, I'm thinking like Canada's like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a huge part of what they're doing is acknowledging what actually happened, and in some cases like learning what actually happened, because you can't heal something if you don't admit what it is.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's one of the other sort of effects of telling the stories this way, is we see that all of this like empathy from these characters, like they were already like sort of primed for that, like you were saying. And the thing that sort of sets it off is that they now have the resources and the information to do something with that empathy. Yeah, I love it.
Oh, Lois Lowry, the mind you have.
Oh, Lois. Okay. So any other thoughts on that? That's like a really big like question.
That's a very deep question.
So,
this is the question that is like the cornerstone of, it's like the quintessential question for your mission for this, like not a genre book club, is like, here, get a load of this. Like,
it really is. It really is. Yeah. I think it does. It perfectly encapsulates the project of this book club.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Lois, for the excellent example. Okay, so I have a couple more things before we start talking about the crafting, like the handiwork, embroidery, because that was one of the reasons that I was very excited to host this one, as we were discussing who would lead the discussion for each book. Okay, so I wanted to mention like very briefly that one of the other similarities I saw between the two books is that they both have these very important like plot things that, or like societal things that are theoretically good ideas, but the way they handle them is like abusive and horrible. Like we talked about a lot of examples with that in The Giver, and in Gathering Blue, I feel like a couple of the ones that I noticed most are like restoration of like, important objects. Like also both my parents are anthropologists. So like very much like, yes, it's good to like keep these important works intact and to very carefully restore them. And then also sort of connected to that, like the preservation of history.
Yeah.
That is another thing that is very important, very good. But it's like the way that they're doing this and the way that they are doing this at the expense of everything else. Because it's like, yeah, they're preserving history, but they're also controlling how it's told. So anyway, if you had other examples of those sort of like theoretical goods, but then we see them used in a way that hurts people, or any sort of other thoughts about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the big one. Like, I was thinking too of like the gathering and like having all your community come together and be like, hey guys, remember, like, this is the history of the world as we know it. Like, it's a lot to sit through, surely, but it is like a fascinating and really cool idea to be like, let's keep our citizens reminded of this, you know? But again, like you said, that's also them being in control of that narrative. So who's to say? And then also too, you have just like implicit bias the same way we have now of history, where it's like, okay, but who decided to write that part of the song about this long ago? Because they had their own feelings about that, and you know, maybe they wrote something out, or maybe they highlighted a certain part of that event, and we just wouldn't know.
Yeah. And I feel like similarly, one of the, I guess, like red flags about like, yeah, these are good things, but one of the other things is that it sort of gives the community like a false sense that they know everything, because like they're telling them the whole history of the world. How could they be hiding anything? And it's like, well, yeah, they are telling you a lot, but the things that they're not telling you are very important. Like the whole like there are no beasts in the forest thing, like that is significant, and it represents like you know, a bigger lie that they're covering up, which is that they just like off people pretty regularly, it seems. Okay, yes. So I think mostly the rest is going to be about the crafting and textile work.
Nice.
And then I think a couple more sort of theme questions connected to that.
Cool.
So I don't know if we want to start with like a vague, like, let's just talk about like I have some specific questions. So do you want to start with the specific question and go from there, or do you want to just like have feelings and then go?
I feel like you have feelings, so maybe go ahead and
I do have feelings.
Start with that, and then maybe it'll lead into one of the questions.
Okay, good idea. So for those watching who maybe aren't aware of this, like it hasn't come up before, I am a big fan of like textile work and like textile crafts. Like I do knit myself, so you know I very much care about that. But just in a more broad sense, I really love when media appreciates and respects this kind of art, especially because it is traditionally associated with women and therefore viewed as being a lesser like art form. Actually, in a lot of cases, it's viewed as a craft and not an art form.
Yeah.
And that is something that I did not, I realized relatively recently that that distinction was a negative thing, like was like a value judgment. Because it's like, you know, painting and sculpture is art, and sewing or embroidery or like things that you do, I mean, all art you do with your hands, but like things that have that extra sort of tactile thing that is done with like weaving or like thread or anything like that, that is a craft. Like you're like it's sort of like the snobbery people have about like trade schools versus like other universities. It's like, oh, well, you work with your hands, so that's like not as impressive or elevated. So I really love when books like Gathering Blue treat it as the art form that it is, and treat it as important. And yeah, I did just have a lot of feelings about that. I really loved that Kira, that is such an important part of the story, and of Kira's journey is that
Mhm.
she is learning the power that gives her, which I think is really beautiful.
Mhm.
Alex says, I love it when books lead to sophisticated, fascinating conversations and analysis. It's so nice. Yes, and this series is prime for that. Like when Julia and I were discussing like what books we were going to like read and discuss together, this series is one that we were like, oh, there's gonna be so much,
Mhm.
so much prime material. Yeah, so I guess those are just my general feelings about the portrayal of crafts and textile work. So do you have sort of general feelings?
Yeah. Well, okay, wait. First, beyond the book, I do feel like the whole semantics issue, I feel like it often comes down to like craft is like people making something that's practical, like I can wear it, I can eat out of it, whatever, versus like, then the art is whatever. It's like we're looking at it, we're observing it, maybe we're discussing it, and that's just like so wild to me because I mean, and this is going to sound like I'm making a judgment then based on like art styles, so take this with a grain of salt, but this is my example of like you could have like a realism painting and an abstract painting with, that's just all blue, right? And then you could be like, well, this one took so much more work, but they're both art. But, like, wouldn't a child painting with only blue paint, you would consider them doing arts and crafts and not be like, fine artwork, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
it's this whole thing where it's like, I don't,
perception. Yeah,
how do we, it's bizarre. Anyways.
yeah. I love what you pointed out with practicality, like lessening an art form, because I don't think I had considered it in those terms, but that really is the distinction that is made, is like, if it is, even if it is beautiful, even if it is, created with the intention of bringing enjoyment just from like looking at it or experiencing it, if you can use it for something, then that is, it's not art. Yeah, which is like, it is so bizarre, and that is so interesting to me, like, in a way. And not like you were saying, Julia, it's like, not that I'm saying that actually other arts are bad, textile art only good art, that's not what I mean. But it's like, it's strange to me that something having an additional layer of like use or function isn't like adding to the art, adding to the beauty, like
That should be
me and my
more.
sister have like a running joke, because she knows that I knit, and if she sees me like wearing something that I knit, like we joke about like, I'm wearing a single knot that I made and I can like turn into clothing, which is like a silly way to say it, but that is what it is, like that's kind of amazing that humans have the capacity to do that, to like make something that is art that you can also wear, and it is all from like a knot in a piece of string. Like,
it's wild.
Yeah.
Anyways, but so beyond that, back to the actual book, remind me the last thing you said about it in terms of, because it's shown as important in Gathering Blue, which I totally agree. I think none of their forms of art are devalued, which is great too from a musical perspective, because you get so many instrumental musicians who are like, oh, your voice is your instrument. It's like, yes, a good singer, their voice is their instrument. Stop being a jerk about it. Like, so that's great too, that a singer is equally shown to be valuable and important. And I don't know if I had anything else to add.
I think the other thing we were talking about was that Kira is like learning, like it gives her power, like this ability that she has. So I don't know if you had something about that you were going to say, but.
Well, I do also love, again, kind of with the speculative element of like, is there magic in what they are doing, or is it just like an innate gift? And she's writing about it very beautifully. I think it's so interesting that there are times when Kira describes the thread as singing to her, and like that it's speaking, and kind of giving life to whatever she's creating. And yet there are other times too where she has so much to learn, and she is like recognizing like, I might have talent for this, but I don't know how to do everything. Like I still have to practice, and I still have to, get this additional information about how to dye the thread. So I think there's a great balance of that as well in this story.
I love that you pointed that out, because that is one of the things that the story highlights, is that like training plus inspiration is art, or inspiration or creativity or whatever you want to call it. It's like there is that like technical aspect, which I think is also cool. And one of the specific discussion points I had actually was, I find it so interesting that even beyond the fact that Kira is a textile artist, there is an extra emphasis on the most hands-on messy parts, because she has to learn how to make the dyes, and it's kind of gross, and it's like messy.
Come on.
But it's like I kind of love that is like acknowledged as, this is absolutely foundational training that she has to have, because you can't create art if you don't have like the boring parts or like the messy parts, and I think that's really, really cool. Hello, welcome. Yes, the voice is absolutely an instrument. Haven't read the book, so I'm wondering whether I should run off to avoid spoilers. We did have a spoiler-free section at the beginning. And actually the craft part, I don't know that we're gonna have. We might talk about the ending, so I don't know. What do you think, Julia? What's the spoiler weather report?
Go back and rewatch the beginning, and then leave when we say we're switching to spoilers. Read the book. It'll take you like 2 hours.
It is a very quick read. Yes. Okay. So another, and I guess this is sort of like in the just general discussion section about art, not just like the specific textile work. The whole thing with the council, to all these kids being like, we will tell you what art to create, is, intentionally a wild sentence, like just like a really interesting and kind of like absurd sounding things. And so I wanted to ask, this is like very philosophical, but can something that is dictated be art? Like following a pattern, for example. And I've talked before about how like I may be biased, because when I knit, like I will make adjustments to patterns, but I don't enjoy just like going off on my own, doing my own thing. It's like I like finding something that I like the look of and then creating that. And like, yeah, I will make small adjustments, but I don't know. It's interesting. And I wanted to talk about that. Like, do we think that something that is patterned, or something that is like dictated to somebody, would you still call that art?
I also have a lot of feelings about this topic, because I think a big part of art for me personally, in like what I view as art in the world, is the skill involved in making it. And so if someone has the ability or the skill or the talent, or however you want to phrase it, to create X object, that is inherently like, you just made that, so that's art, right? Like if I went on a vacation to England and I saw that beautiful portrait of Anna of Cleves, I wouldn't be like, well, Hans Holbein isn't a real artist because this was, he had a patron that requested this portrait, right? Like that would be bonkers to say. So, I would argue that it's the ability of making it that kind of inherently makes it art to me.
Yeah. And I, also us both having theater backgrounds, being in something scripted doesn't mean that isn't art. It's not like the person who writes the story is the artist, and then we're just like the little robots who make it happen. And one of the other things, and this connects back to The Giver. So one of the things that I sort of came to think, because like when I was like writing this question, I was like, genuinely, I don't know. Like, I wanted to say yes, of course that's art, but I could also understand. I could kind of theoretically understand why people would say, like, if you don't have the idea, that's not the same. Like, having good craftsmanship, you know, or good like execution is important, but it's not the same as like, I created this thing with no input, or not even no input, because everybody has like input. But anyway, so the bottom line that I sort of came to is, like in The Giver, the act of choosing is important. And so even if you are making something that is patterned or that is like dictated in some way, the fact that you are choosing to do that and that your skill is what makes that happen, I think, yes, that is still art.
Yeah. And think of it this way too. The council, they find those children specifically to do these tasks that they are not capable of doing.
Yeah.
They found those children because Kira can do that needlework. Thomas can do that carving. Joe can sing that song so beautifully. You know, if it was easy, if it wasn't art, why isn't Joe Schmo doing it?
Yeah.
Why isn't Jameson the carver? You know, it's like, clearly there's something important there about their abilities.
Yeah.
And also even the little, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I would say throughout history, a lot of art students were students to masters who would have taught them how to do it and what to do, developing the skills, and then following the rules to then decide to follow or break the rules. Yes, I think that is a really excellent point, and kind of what we were talking about with like this, you need to have this grounding of technique. Like Kira has to understand like colors and what dyes make colors. Like you have to do the basics. Like when you're singing or doing music, you have to do scales. They're boring, but you need to do them. So what were you going to say, Julia?
Well, I was going to say, even in the process of creating those things too, there are choices being made. You know, Kira's looking at the color she's trying to match and thinking, do I use this plant or do I use that plant to get the closest to that shade? You know, Thomas is thinking like, which tool is going to get me this angle carved the way I need. I don't know things about carving, but you know what I mean? Like,
this is sort of carving example. Yeah.
So there's choice in those little aspects as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in embroidery and sewing work, I have seen that there is this kind of this like looking down on like cross stitch or like sewn pieces that have the pattern like printed on it, rather than it being something that you have to like count yourself. And that's always really doesn't sit well with me. For one thing, I think it is like one of many examples of like, this craft is already looked down on. Why are we doing this to each other? Like, why? And it's also, it's, as you were saying, it's like you still need to make the choices. Like not even like, even when the colors are assigned to you, like counted cross stitch or stamped cross stitch, you still have to make the choice about how you're doing the stitch. Like even if it tells you the stitch to do, you have to like make the decisions of where to put your needle and like where to even like what order to do colors in, because that is another thing. Like I haven't done cross stitch in quite a while but when I did, like that was a huge thing too, is picking where to start, because you want to get as much as possible done in the same color without having to jump around too much. And you also had to be very careful about when you were changing threads. So even it's like even those little mechanical decisions, I think again this sort of speaks to like the more mechanical parts of like art that people think aren't art, but like yes it is, because it's part of the finished piece. Like there is technicality involved, and that's okay. So yes, thank you for being here, Alpha Books. Yes. And I hope that if you do pick up Gathering Blue, I hope you enjoy it. I'd love to hear.
Yes. Please do. It's so good.
It's a good one. Yeah.
I promise.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts on that?
I don't think so.
Okay. I think the last official question I had before we get into quotes or other things we want to talk about. Like, we didn't talk about Jameson specifically. We also didn't talk about Matt, and I know
I want to talk about Matt.
Okay, so before we do that, I have one other theme question, and I'm going to read 2 quotes. So that was what he had marked. He had written the words so that he could repeat them. Painful though it was to hear the accusations repeated, Kira realized with awe the value of the repetition. There would be no argument afterward about what had been said. How often among the tykes, fistfights and battles had begun from you said, I said, he said that you said, and the infinite variations. And then the other one, when he read the word hollyhock aloud with his finger on the word, she saw that it was long, with many lines like tall stems. She turned her eyes away quickly so that she would not learn it, would not be guilty of something clearly forbidden to her. But it made her smile to see it, to see how the pen formed the shapes, and the shapes told the story of a name. So, those are the 2 big quotations that I marked about reading or writing. And my question for this part, this is not a book that is really about the written word. Like, that's definitely, I don't think, a prominent focus. But we have those great lines about the power of words and of stories, and specifically of the ability to read and write. And so I wanted to ask, like, why do you think she threw those in there? Like, this is not a book about reading, but we have some really, like, these quotes would fit in perfectly in a book that was more heavily focused on that. So let's discuss.
I mean, I think one element to that could be the fact that in Kira's community, we're seeing, again, like the control of information through the gathering, and it's very much like an oral storytelling tradition. What's a song? But you know what I mean. And so, and as you said earlier too, we see that sort of the control over the general population and their lack of things overall clearly must include lack of general, like, just like accessibility to knowledge and the written word,
Education,
and education in general. Yeah, there's never a time when Kira's like, and then the tykes are going off to school. No, the tykes are in a pen, remember? Like,
they're in a livestock pen.
And the girls are not allowed to read, right? So
yeah,
I think there's definitely part of it could be her saying, like, this is an important part of the community that's missing, is the literacy, is learning through story and through the written word, and the power that that has too. And then also, don't you love when you like lose your train of thought and it's like, what was the other thing I was gonna say? I don't know. Share your thoughts, and I'm sure it'll come back to me.
Yeah, so I agree. I love your answer. And I think that when you were talking, like, really emphasizing like information and the withholding of information, or like controlling who gets to have which kind of information, I feel like by having those parts about the written word, and we do have, like, it is periodically like brought up because Thomas can read and write and Kira can't. So it's not that it doesn't show up in the book at all. And so by having those like small reminders throughout the story, I also feel like, and you kind of alluded to this when you were talking about like information and how, like, at its most basic, it's about conveying information, like what we were talking about earlier, where the sort of base requirement of doing something about the bad things that are happening is like knowing that they're happening. Like, it's so basic that it almost sounds, I don't know, like a silly thing to like articulate, but it's like, if the characters don't have exposure to knowledge, how are they going to do something about the issues or the situations?
Right. Yeah. There's if you have a question, right? Like, are there beasts? Kira can't go to the library and look up books about the history of beasts in her village, right? Like,
yeah,
even if those things were false, but
yeah. And I think like oral history is obviously important and valuable as well. And I don't feel that Lois Lowry is saying like oral history is not important or like it's more primitive. I think that like the quotes about books are really highlighting that it's important to have different kinds of information. Like, and that's part of accessibility, is just having like different paths available to people, and like there are different strengths. Like sometimes like there is some information that is so dangerous that you can't write it down, and like that is something that is like unique to oral history and oral storytelling, in addition to all the like cultural significance it can have. So they have different strengths, and I think that by bringing up literacy in this book, I think it is highlighting like it is limiting to only have one kind of information. Alex says, I need to read this book ASAP. Sounds pretty incredible. Yes. that is one of our core takeaways from this.
I know. It's driving me nuts. I'm trying to find, I feel like there's a line about when Kira first goes to, what the heck is the building even called? I feel like there's a time when she's like, wow, look at all those books. Like she just notices because she's like, I've never seen like, a shelf full of books like that.
I remember that. I think you're right. I think it's interesting, and I didn't realize this until I was reading the quotes out back to back, but it's very interesting to me that they sort of address two different things about the written word. The first one is very like knowledge and data focused, and it is like, about the truth and like the power of like having a record of what was said and what happens. And that is incredibly important. And then the second quote is like about the beauty of the written word and telling a story, and how like art is a different kind of truth, but it's still important. Like I love that.
Yes. It's driving me, I'm like, I will never find it, but yes. And I hope that came across too, because I do think I tried very specifically to say like, it's not that, if they had everything in writing, then the history of the world would be so clear and there would be no lies in it. But that's just like a missing element to their accessibility to information, is just a different avenue of it.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So do you want to talk about Matt? I know that you had some thoughts about him, like
baby boy.
I found him a little annoying at first and at different points, but like he grew on me.
He's such a funny character because at the beginning he's just like this grody little street urchin who's just like following Kira around, and you're like, okay, clearly I don't get the charm, but she likes this kid, so whatever. It just kind of is what it is. But I think as the story progresses, and Matt is a very constant presence, it seems like you would think the way the arc of the story goes, that kind of once she befriends Thomas, that Matt would kind of like fade away. No, he's still like so present, so relevant the whole time. They're
just like pops up when you least expect it.
He's a little bit of he's definitely a little plot device of a child. Like anytime they need like Kira to go somewhere or to get a new piece of information, Matt's like, hello, here I am.
In fairness, though, that is kind of his personality, is like he gets into everything. So it kind of like, if they were going to assign this plot device to a character, it makes sense that it's Matt, because he's nosy AF. Like,
it's true. You're so right. But he does really grow on me. I feel like as you go through the story, you begin to see like he's not, because of his circumstances in life, you think that he's going to be a very like selfish little kid, right? Everything's like, well, what are you going to do for me? If I do something for you, what do I get in return, right?
Yeah.
Which, to be fair, they surely must have some kind of barter economy anyways, because like how are people even, you know what I mean? Like people are
Yeah.
stealing out of Kira's garden and people are weaving textiles, but like then what do they do with them? Like I have so many questions about that.
I need to know about the economy of this tiny little village. Like,
um but you begin to see like he is quite selfless, actually. He is very caring.
the thing is, yeah, since we're in spoiler territory, I guess we can go ahead and say when
Yeah.
he just shows up at the end and he's like, oh, hey, it's your dad.
Yeah.
And that I mean, I was really afraid, like, when they couldn't find him in, like, suspicious circumstances, I was immediately like, somebody killed that child. Like, I was seeing murder everywhere.
Oh, no.
So thankfully that didn't happen. But, yeah, I agree. I think that Matt is, understandably, he's kind of introduced as, in a way where it's like, everything has to be transactional because it's so hard to just survive in this community that it makes sense why, especially because like he doesn't have super active guardians, why he would have to be so practical about it. But it's like as the story goes on, it's like, yeah, he does care about Kira. Like he does, like he cares about his little dog so much. Like
Branch.
Yeah. And I think isn't one of the first things we hear from him about how he like rescued the dog, and I'm like, okay, you're a good one. Like,
Yeah,
Matt, you can stay.
It was such a, again, it's classic Lois where she just delivers the right information at the right time for us. Like when she's like, and here's a story about when Asher said smack instead of snack. Here's Kira remembering how Branch started following Matt around because he found him wounded and he patched up his little broken tail and nursed him back to health. And she even, I love that she has the thought like within the narrative where she's like, I don't even know who else would have known what to do with the dog, let alone cared enough to take care of him. And my heart.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, there's a really good quote about Matt and I can't find it. I know we're going to get to quotes, but I wanted it. I guess if I looked up my color key, then I might know what's what, and that would probably help. Light blue, maybe? Let's see. Nope, too far. I also love how much of a mom Kira is to Matt. Like the fact that she's like, and we're giving you a bath, and don't grab. You have to ask when you want something. Yeah. It's just so funny, but very sweet too. Oh my gosh, where is this dang line? Oh, okay, there it is. So anyways, I found this because it's specifically about Matt. When Kira and Thomas are talking about Joe, and Thomas is like, Matt would find a way to get free because he's such a little rascal. But then he says, anyway, they wouldn't want Matt, I'm afraid. They only want us for our skills, and he hasn't any. Kira thought of the impish boy, of his generosity and his laughter, of his devotion to the little dog. She thought of him now, wherever he was, on his quest to bring a gift to friends. Oh, Thomas, she said, he does. He knows just how to make us smile and laugh. And the fact that to Kira, she's like, that's not any lesser of an important skill to have. Like, it's so beautiful. Oh, yes, and the cover's really pretty.
Yes. I know that Matt's gift is empathy and kindness.
Yeah.
Which is so funny because, like, when you meet him, it's like, ew. Like you just said, like, who is he? Yeah. Yep.
But I guess if that wants to lead us into quotes, so be it.
Let's do it. Let's go for quotes.
Can I say, while you're searching for a quote you want to share, one of the tab colors that I included was specifically tracking parallels between Kira and Jonas. And there were so many more than I even remembered that I became like emotional about it because I was like, oh, another one. Wow. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah. So unsurprisingly, a lot of these, I think probably my most prominent tab color was about the textile and the crafting and that art. Kira had always had a clever way with her hands. When she was still a tyke, her mother had taught her to use a needle, to pull it through woven fabric and create a pattern with colored threads. But suddenly, recently, the skill had become more than simple cleverness. In one astounding burst of creativity, her ability had gone far beyond her mother's teaching. Now, without instruction or practice, without hesitancy, her fingers felt the way to twist and weave and stitch the special threads together to create designs rich and explosive with color. She did not understand how the knowledge had come to her, but it was there in her fingertips, and now they trembled slightly with eagerness to start, if only she was allowed to stay. And it has that sort of like quasi-magical, like there is certainly an elevated like power, that she's got. And also the fact that like that little scrap of cloth can like, I don't know, tell the future. I don't know. So there's like speculative parts to it. But I also like that if you think of it in a more, I guess, metaphorical way, like there is that point when you are learning or practicing any kind of like craft or ability. There is that moment where it's like, oh, it's not just mechanical. Like I can feel the artistic part more. And when she talks about like her fingertips like trembling slightly with eagerness to start, like when I knit or like when I haven't done it for a while and I'm like looking forward to it, like my fingers don't tremble, but it's like it's like a metaphorical like itchiness, it's like I don't know, I like that. Like I connected to Kira.
That is good. Here's a nice short one. Take pride in your pain, her mother had always told her. You are stronger than those who have none. I like all of the flashbacks that she has like about her mother. I'm like, oh, my heart.
I know. And I feel like that also highlights that like, yes, the story is about Kira, but like it seems like a lot of people in this community are also just doing their best, and being kind where they can. And just because they haven't been exposed to the same information, it doesn't mean that they're not also good people. Like I also was very considering how little she's in the book, I was like very affected by Kira's relationship with her mother. I thought that was really lovely.
And I think on the opposite end, I'm also very, very moved by Kira's relationship with Joe. And when, even though she knows her so briefly, well, I'll just find the dang quote. Why am I even going to try to paraphrase this? Stop. Oh, let's find it. Is that it? Nope. Something about this book is that I have no sense of the pacing of this story, because I'll be like, that happened towards the end, and then I look for it and it's in the middle of the book and I'm like, I clearly don't know anything. It's fine.
Yeah. Oh, I found the one you were talking about with Matt.
Yeah.
Where it says like it's her dad talking about how he was like taken care of by this other group of people. I didn't know. I couldn't see them. My eyes were destroyed and I was almost delirious with pain, but I could hear their comforting voices, so I drank the liquid and gave myself up to their care. Kira was astonished. In her entire lifetime in the village, she had never encountered a single person who would have done such a thing. She knew no one who would be willing to soothe or comfort or aid a grievously wounded being, or who would know how. Except Matt, she thought, remembering how the boy had nursed his little damaged dog back to life.
My heart. Why is that line so sweet? Dang it. And then, cool, now that I'm on the verge of tears, I did find the scene with Joe, so I still cry. Kira smoothed the blanket. Good night, then. For a moment she sat there on the bed, feeling a vague memory of something else that should be done. Something from when she was a small tyke, like this, being put to bed. She leaned down toward the little girl intuitively. What was it that her mother had done when she was small? Kira put her lips on Joe's forehead. It was an unfamiliar gesture, but felt right. The little girl made a small, contented sound with her own lips against Kira's face. A little kissy, she whispered. Like me mum. Like the fact that she has to like remember, she's like, it feels like there's a part of this ritual that's missing, and like the use of the word intuitively in there, I'm like, wow. Love, it's important.
Yeah. That is a really beautiful moment. This is with Kira and Annabella. So this is what we were talking about with like needing that knowledge of like dyes and colors and like the messy parts you're not handling threads for some of it. So you must come each day, Annabella repeated. You must learn all the plants, all the colors, as your mum did when she was a girl. I will, I promise. She said you had the knowledge in your fingers, more than she did. Kira looked at her hands folded in her lap. Something happens when I work with the threads. They seem to know things on their own, and my fingers simply follow. Annabella nodded. That be the knowledge. I got it for the colors, but never for the threads. My hands was always too coarse. She held them up, stained and misshapen. But to use the knowledge of the threading, you must learn the making of the shades. When to satin with the iron pot, how to bloom the colors, how to bleed. To satin, to bloom, to bleed. What a strange set of words. Yeah,
I annotated that last line too, because I'm like,
yeah,
whoa.
the emotion of those verbs is like doing so much heavy lifting. Like,
yeah. And actually, I think, wait, I need to, what page is that on?
94 at the very top.
Because I remember I wrote, hello, puberty, to sadden, to bloom, to bleed. Yeah. But also, it's a very pretty line. But I was like, yep.
That's hilarious, yeah. Let's see. Some of the quotes I marked, they're just like, it's not even necessarily that they're as beautiful as some of the others, but it's like, oh, yep, big idea moment here.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, because there's the one where Thomas is talking about, this is at the beginning, they're talking about what they're being expected to do. And Kira says, what is your usual work, Thomas? Mine's the robe, of course, but what have they set you to do? The singer's staff, it's very old, and his hands, and the hands of other singers in the past, I suppose, have worn the carvings down, so it must all be recarved. It's difficult work, but important. The singer uses the carvings of the staff to find his place, to remind him of the sections in the song. And there's a large place at the top that has never been carved. Eventually, I'll be doing that, carving it for the first time, making my own designs. He laughed. Not my own, really. They'll tell me what to put there. Like, that is such a... Mm-hmm. And even though, like we were saying, like, Thomas isn't as ready as Kira is to, like, start noticing, you know, the things that aren't right. But, like, there are those, like, moments where he sort of knows it in spite of himself, you know? Like, he's laughing because, like, this isn't how it's supposed to be. But I am consciously not thinking that.
Yeah, he was like, oh, my own? No, of course not mine. Why would they let me do it? Yeah. Another one that's just, like, so simple in the moment, but so big in terms of idea, is really early when Jameson is appointed as Kira's defender. And he's, you know, reading all the accusations. And then he says, so we may set aside the assertion that it is the way, Jameson announced with certainty. It need not always be the way.
Yep. And in the same category of really big idea in deceptively simple language. This is near the end, actually, when Kira and Thomas are, I think it's at the gathering, maybe, or it would have to be, I think. Quickly, reminding herself of the custom, she bowed her head toward the worship object on the stage. Then she followed Thomas, and together they took their places in two of the chairs. A murmur passed through the audience, and Kira felt her face flush in embarrassment. She didn't like being singled out. She didn't want to sit here at the front. She remembered the derisive voice of one of the weavers only a few days before. "She don't need us no more," the woman had called. "It's not true. I need all of you. We need each other."
Mm-hmm.
Again, echoes of Jonas, like, of course we care. It's the point of everything.
It's that line of this book, 100%.
Yeah.
Ugh. It's another one that I know I marked too. It's so good. Here's one that I like about Kira's needlework, or more about the dyeing, actually. Her mother did not know how to make blue. Sometimes they talked of it, Kira and Katrina, looking at the huge upturned bowl of the sky above their world. "If only I could make blue," her mother said. "I've heard that somewhere there's a special plant." She looked at her own garden, thick with the flowers and shoots from which she could create the golds and greens and pinks, and shook her head in yearning for the one color she could not create.
Yeah. That was another thing, like, I thought about even doing an official question about it. Like, the fact that there is this one color that is sort of, like, central in both books. Yeah. Okay, this is one of those, like, I'm going to read, like, a page and a half, so everyone just buckle up. But it's also good. This is, like, at the very, very end. This is, like, a few pages before I turned the page and was shocked to be like, no more book? What?
Hello!
So this is after... So Kira's dad has been like, "Hey, come with me." And she's like, "Yeah, I do kind of want to get out of here." And this is her realizing, like, I can't do that. Like, no, I'm not going to leave. And she had seen the chain that is on the singer, and she thinks about Joe having that chain, and she's like, I have to do something about this. He lowered the robe then, and she saw nothing more. Perhaps she thought she had imagined it, but watching him as he moved, she heard the sound of the scraping chain against the floor, and she could see behind him a smeared, darkened trail of his blood. Recalling it now, Kira knew, suddenly and with clarity, what it all meant. It was so simple. The three of them, the new little singer who would one day take the chained singer's place, Thomas the carver, who with his meticulous tools wrote the history of the world, and she herself, the one who colored that history. They were the artists who could create the future. Kira could feel it in her fingertips, her ability to twist and weave the colors into the scenes of amazing beauty that she had made all alone before they assigned her the task of the robe. Thomas had told her that once he too had carved astonishing things into wood that seemed to come alive in his hands, and she could hear the high, haunting melody that the child had sung in her magical voice, solitary in her room, before they had forced her from it and given her their own song to sing. The guardians with their stern faces had no creative power, but they had strength and cunning, and they had found a way to steal and harness other people's powers for their own needs. They were forcing the children to describe the future they wanted, not the one that could be. Kira watched the garden tremble and move as it slept. She saw the newly planted woad settle in, nestled where she had laid it gently beside the yellow bedstraw. "Mostly it dies after flowering once," Annabella had said, describing woad. "But sometimes you find a small shoot lives." It was those small living shoots she had planted, and something in Kira knew without a doubt that they would survive. She knew something else as well, and with the realization, she rose from the damp grass to go indoors, to find her father and tell him that she could not be his eyes, that she must stay.
Yeah. Oh man.
Like, there's
Lois.
so much. There's so much in that, like, the way that, like, we're led to Kira's decision, and it's partly from seeing the chains. It's partly from realizing that these kids with their art have the ability to literally create the future, like literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
It's like that little quiet moment at the end where she's looking at the garden and she sees those little shoots.
Mm-hmm. And wow, accidentally found a little paragraph that ties in perfectly with, like, the end of that with the shoots growing up. This is when Kira thinks that, oh, they probably stole all the vegetables I had been growing with my mother, but they probably wouldn't know to pick up the plants that she had been growing to dye threads. And so she goes back to look. Clearly the women, dragging their bushes to build the pen, had simply walked across the area. Yet the blossoms continued to bloom, and she was awed to see that the vibrant life still struggled to thrive despite such destruction. I wrote, "That's you, Kira."
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
But I mean, like, yeah.
it is. It is.
It's
And
just,
another part I wanted to highlight in the monologue I just gave everyone. So they're talking a lot about like how these kids made art themselves and it was beautiful before they were told like what to do with it. And even though like you could take that as, you know, what we were saying is like, you know, some people think that if you don't create the idea or the concept and you just execute it, that's not art. But one of the things that they say is that when they're talking about Joe and the high haunting melody that the child had sung in her magical voice, solitary in her room, before they had forced her from it. So it's what makes something art is like what we were saying earlier, like it is about choice. And you are still making choices when you are creating something. So it's not like the big problem isn't necessarily that they're following patterns. The big problem is they aren't given a choice about any of it, you know? Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Yep. And I think the last one I marked, which was just like I don't know, it's just like an interesting part. I don't know how to even like categorize it. Where Kira is telling her father, "One day our villages will know each other." Kira assured him, "I can feel that already." It was true. She could feel the future through her hands, in the pictures her hands were urging her to make. She could feel the broad, undecorated expanse waiting across the shoulders of the robe. Like, I don't know. It makes me feel things. I don't know what they are.
It makes me feel things. I know. I'm trying to go through my last couple tabs and be like, do I want to share any of these? There's the kissy. Oh, here's another nice one. Another good one about her craft. Suddenly, Kira knew that although her door was unlocked, she was not really free. You didn't read this, did you? I had
I
a
don't think
sense of
so.
deja vu.
No.
Okay. Her life was limited to these things and this work. She was losing the joy that she had once felt when the brightly colored threads that took shape in her hands, when the patterns that came to her and were her own. The robe did not belong to her, though she was learning its story through her work. She would almost be able to tell the history now that it had passed through her fingers, now that she had focused on it so closely for so many days. But it was not her hands, or it was, nope, but it was not what her hands or heart yearned to do. Again, about like the choice.
Yeah. It also like it sort of reminds me of like the very modern conversation about like capitalism making you monetize all your hobbies. Like obviously that's not what this book specifically is dealing with, but I think like the ideas there's a lot of like applicability to other parts of society. But
did you read the quote about them filling the blank places when
I don't know. Go ahead.
I love this part. When they see the fen where Matt is from. Why must there be such a horrible place? Kira whispered to Thomas. Why do people have to live like this? It's how it is, he replied, frowning. It's always been. Well, pause there because I wrote, and back and back and back. A sudden vision slid into Kira's mind. The robe and how it had always been. And what Thomas had said was not true. There had been times, oh, such long ago times, when people's lives had been golden and green. Why could there not be such times again? She began to say it to him. Thomas, she suggested, you and I, we're the ones who will fill the blank places. Maybe we can make it different.
Yeah. There's that like looking to the future, but also like how knowing that things have been better in the past can give you like courage and strength. Like again, like having the information. Such a good one.
Oh, I love this book. Okay. I'm almost through all the tabs. You've read that one, so we're good there. Skippy. Her father cries. I want to cry too. We found the line about Matt, which I appreciate. Yeah. And some of these are more just thematic ones. One of my tab colors was obviously all about family. So I'm like, that's a family one. That's a family one. And you read that one. And did you read this? Yes, you read that one. Yeah. at the end of the one you read where it's like, to find her father and tell him she could not be his eyes, that she must stay. I wrote, it's giving the giver.
It's giving the giver.
Because he's like, I gotta stay and help these people deal with their problems. So
Yeah,
like, yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. I'm fresh out of quotes.
Yeah. So,
Oh, you froze for a second. Don't leave me. Don't leave me like this, Kara. No. Kara, no. We're right at the end.
Okay, are we good? Sorry.
You're good. You're good. You're back.
My internet was like, let's wrap this up. Like
I was like, no, this is right here at the end. Don't leave.
So I think that concludes our discussion of Gathering Blue, which like our discussion is almost as long as you just reading the book.
Yeah,
Which is how
everyone who watched this, you could have read it.
I love it though. I mean, it's such a short book, and yet there's so much to discuss. Okay, so we are going to be continuing in approximately a month. Which one comes next, Julia? Is it
Messenger?
Messenger. Okay, and that is going to be hosted on Julia's channel, and she will be leading the discussion for that one.
Yeah.
And I'm once again very excited. I have been having the best time reading these books for the first time. So
I'm so excited. This one is the shortest of the whole quartet, so buckle up in that regard. Also, I know I've only read this once, so I'm very intrigued because I remember so very little about it. I think I remember truly like one reveal that we get, and I'm like, oh. But I will say, to pique your interest, Kara, and everyone else's interest, this book is not as nebulously connected. It is very much more clearly connected to prior events that we've read about. So,
ooh, that does pique my interest.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you guys so much for discussing with us. Julia, thank you as always for being a wonderful co-host and just like getting to feel our feelings together.
Yeah. Thank you for making me cry.
And yeah, we will be on Julia's channel. We will announce that hopefully in a reasonable time frame. We'll see. We weren't too bad with this one. We had like we had a few more days notice, but yeah, and thank you to those who watch this back later. I know we get some of those, so yeah, it's been really, really wonderful having y'all along for the Not a Genre experience and the little series read along we've been doing. Yeah, so I will talk to you later. Don't forget to follow Julia. I also linked the playlist for the book club in case you want like more information. And also we will be announcing our next few books, I think, coming up pretty soon.
Because it's almost time.
I know. So very excited for that. And I hope you guys have a good one. Now we get to end.